The little market town of Flaxborough had been unusually quiet that Tuesday evening, a quiet so complete that even the clatter of the late buses seemed hesitant, as though unsure it had a right to disturb the air. Inspector Purbright, perched behind the polished oak desk in his office at the precinct, allowed himself a small, secret pleasure, the ticking of the brass clock over the mantelpiece, regular and dependable, an honest companion in a world prone to oddities. His thoughts, as always, were more attuned to human eccentricity than to crime itself, though he understood well enough that the two were often entwined. The peculiar could escalate quietly into the criminal, and the criminal often masqueraded as ordinary. This particular evening promised neither spectacle nor urgency. Yet, as the inspector would soon learn, appearances were treacherously deceptive. At precisely 11:59 p.m., the town's most ambitious endeavour of the week, the live BBC radio broadcast of Flaxborough Community Hour, vanished as though spirited away by some invisible hand. One moment, Mr. Herbert Grigg, the station's mildly pompous presenter, was in mid-announcement, extolling the virtues of the parish flower show, and the next moment the microphone emitted only static. The listeners, a small but devoted audience scattered across the cobbled streets and terrace houses, were abruptly cast into silence. Miss Prudence Ballard, a clerk in the town library and an avid listener, had leaned over her teacup, pen poised for notes on the upcoming horticultural lecture, when the crackle began. "How peculiar," she murmured, tapping the receiver. Her cat, Mr. Whiskers, twitched an ear, perhaps pondering the metaphysics of vanished sound. Across the town, the sudden hush was met with muttered curses, some mild and some politely indignant. The disappearance of the broadcast was small in scale, but it resonated strangely, almost conspiratorially, through the otherwise banal hours. By 12:05 a.m., Mr. Grigg had returned to the microphone, pale, but trying valiantly to maintain his usual effervescence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he stammered, "we seem to have experienced a minor interruption. Technical difficulties, I assure you." Yet there was an odd tightness about his hands, the twitch of his left eye, a hesitation in his carefully rehearsed lines. Even from the station control booth, where Purbright had been asked to offer a quiet look into what some worried might be sabotage, the inspector noted these small inconsistencies. Flaxborough, like most small towns, was fertile ground for whispered conjecture. Within hours, the local post office was humming with speculation. Mr. Gibbons, a gentleman of considerable authority in postal affairs and the occasional letter writer to the Times, had declared the interruption an affront to the very dignity of civic broadcast. Mrs. Pemberton, who ran the sweet shop and had a penchant for connecting every modern event to long-standing grievances, whispered that it was probably one of the council's new committees fiddling again. Even the vicar's housekeeper suggested divine interference, though she added prudently that she might be wrong. It was in this atmosphere of polite panic that Inspector Purbright made his measured approach to the station the next morning. The building, a modest brick affair near the railway, seemed undisturbed, yet the front office buzzed with hushed conversation. Engineers in dark sweaters adjusted equipment nervously. Mr. Grigg hovered near the radiator, muttering about impossible waves and fleeting anomalies. Purbright, unobtrusive but observant, noticed the slight creases in Grigg's forehead, the faint smudge of ink on his cuffs, a detail that would matter little to anyone but hinted, in Purbright's mind, at nervous transcription. "Inspector," said Mr. Grigg with the obligatory polite bow, "thank you for coming so promptly. It is, unusual, is it not?" "Yes, Mr. Grigg," Purbright replied, voice even, composed, revealing nothing. "Unusual and therefore worth a quiet inspection. I trust your staff are prepared to recount events calmly." Grigg flinched slightly at the word calmly, as though it were a rare commodity in the town's broadcast office. He nodded, gesturing toward Miss Claire Holloway, a young technician with the resolute air of someone accustomed to minute irregularities. "Very well," Purbright said, seating himself on the edge of the control room chair. "Let us begin at the point of anomaly, step by step, nothing omitted." Miss Holloway spoke carefully, her tone clipped but not unkind. "We were mid-segment, discussing the flower show, and then the audio just cut. Nothing seemed amiss before, no warning lights, no loose connections." She tapped the console. "I tried the backup feed, same result, then static, and Mr. Grigg went pale. I restarted the system 3 times. Only after 12 did the signal return." "3 restarts?" Purbright's voice remained mild. "And no one touched any of the controls outside your supervised attempts?" "No, Inspector," she replied. A faint tension tightened her lips. "No one else had access." Purbright nodded, jotting a single word in his notebook. "Odd." The police chronicle of Flaxborough was littered with incidents that began oddly, often escalating subtly before their resolution seemed, to outsiders, almost mundane. He looked around the room, eyes briefly settling on the small items that littered every work surface. A half-empty cup of tea, a pair of spectacles that did not belong to any of the staff, a notebook lying open at the edge of the desk. It was nothing in itself, yet each object in the quiet universe of Flaxborough carried a story, some trivial, some telling, some merely decoy. Outside, the town stirred to life. Early delivery carts rumbled over cobbled stones, the baker's boy whistled tunelessly, and gossip threads spun themselves into half-truths. But within the station, amid humming equipment and the occasional nervous cough, a subtler drama had begun, invisible to the townsfolk, yet ripe for the inspector's meticulous attention. Purbright rose at last, his notebook tucked neatly under one arm. "I shall return," he said softly. "Meanwhile, maintain your usual vigilance, but no unnecessary modifications. Often the truth waits for stillness, not interruption." As he left the building and stepped into the quiet dawn, the town appeared as it always did, polite, routine, and reassuringly mundane. Yet Purbright's mind lingered on the missing minute of broadcast, the flicker of an eyelid, the shadow of a hand over a microphone. It was small, almost laughable, but Flaxborough had a way of making the small significant. And sometimes the smallest irregularity had consequences the size of the town itself. Thus began the curious case of the lost broadcast, a crime that required no pursuit through alleyways or ghastly crime scenes, only patience, observation, and the gentle unraveling of a community's concealed peculiarities. Inspector Purbright, as ever, would let the town speak for itself, listening carefully, noting discrepancies, and waiting, ever so politely, for the first clue that could be followed without alarm. The town, blissfully unaware of the inspector's quiet scrutiny, continued its morning routines, while somewhere in the maze of cables and static, the invisible culprit, or perhaps merely the accident, awaited discovery. And Purbright, adjusting his hat against the chill, knew the subtle truth of Flaxborough, that beneath civility lay a careful choreography of secrecy, error, and human pride. By mid-morning, Flaxborough had fully awakened, and with awakening came the inevitable hum of speculation. The lost broadcast was no longer merely a technical curiosity. It had become a narrative embroidered by every observer who fancied themselves an analyst of civic affairs. At the market square, Mrs. Pemberton leaned over the counter of her sweet shop, sharing with a cluster of elderly ladies a meticulously embroidered version of the night's events. According to her, someone, not machinery, had interfered deliberately, and though she lacked evidence, she knew without doubt who the guilty party must be. Mr. Gibbons, in his post office domain, contributed his own interpretation, arguing at considerable length with the newly installed council clerk about the moral decay that such disruptions portended. He spoke of order, duty, and the sanctity of the public ear, all the while gesturing toward the sky as if the very heavens might corroborate his argument. The council clerk, a pale and conscientious youth, nodded politely but with the faintest twitch of incredulity at the older gentleman's fervour. Meanwhile, the library, where Miss Prudence Ballard had returned to her ledger of horticultural notes, became a quiet junction for hushed conjecture. Patrons stopped in mid-browsing to remark on the scandalous disappearance of sound, each adding their preferred embellishment. One student, a timid fellow with a penchant for precise grammar, insisted that it was likely a minor interference with possibly grave social consequences. Prudence, inwardly amused, made no correction, choosing instead to note the tone and timing of the remark, recognizing in it the same subtle self-importance that Purbright himself often found in the town's citizens. Purbright, during his routine inspections, observed these ripples with a patient gaze. He noticed, for instance, that Mr. Gibbons, in his very concern for propriety, consistently misquoted the minute at which the broadcast had failed, suggesting either a lapse in memory or a desire to amplify the severity. Mrs. Pemberton, on the other hand, repeated certain phrases, deliberate interference and someone must answer, with a curious insistence, a pattern Purbright would file quietly in the mental catalogue of the town's behavioural clues. The inspector also noted subtler variations. Miss Holloway, when asked by her colleagues about the interruption, seemed eager to downplay her own technical competence, speaking softly of unforeseen anomalies, as though reluctant to admit the possibility of human error. And Mr. Grigg, ever the presenter, moved through his daily routines with a restrained, nervous energy. His morning announcements were precise, his sentences clipped just slightly, his eyes avoiding direct contact for longer than usual. Purbright considered all these details as he made his way home along the dew-dampened streets, each small observation weaving into an intricate tapestry that promised eventual clarity. As he walked, the inspector reflected on the nature of gossip in Flaxborough. Here, truth was rarely the first casualty. Rather, it was the fifth or sixth, displaced by embellishments, assumptions, and the innate human desire to matter in a story larger than oneself. The town, in its social rituals, had already begun to assign motives, personalities, and even possible conspirators to a brief lapse in sound, a lapse whose technical origins were still unknown. By late morning, the council convened, though not officially. In the tea-room adjacent to the town hall, councillors and their acquaintances gathered, ostensibly to discuss minor administrative concerns, but naturally the lost broadcast dominated every conversation. Mr. Craddock, the senior councillor, displayed a particular fascination with the notion of sabotage. He sketched, with the back of a napkin, a hypothetical sequence of events involving unnamed malcontents and technical mischief, while his colleagues debated the plausibility of each scenario. Purbright, appearing discreetly for a brief observation, recognized the familiar pattern. Civic minds weaving fiction from limited fact, each stitch a reflection of personal biases. Later, at the railway station, a group of regular commuters exchanged their interpretations of the incident. Mr. Trundle, who prided himself on his meticulous punctuality, argued that the delay in the broadcast had altered his perception of time, and in consequence the entire town's schedule was subtly, though disastrously, disrupted. Mrs. Kenworthy, who had a penchant for order in tea-making, countered that the anomaly demonstrated a general decline in modern standards, citing as evidence the misplaced sugar bowl she had encountered that morning. Purbright, passing on his rounds, observed from a respectful distance, noting each inflection, each hesitation, and the occasional slip of emphasis that betrayed personal involvement in the tale. It was in these measured observations that the first plausible thread of inquiry began to emerge. Purbright did not yet speak of suspects, for the evidence remained scattered and indistinct, yet the subtle tensions, the inconsistencies in recollection, and the uncharacteristic nervousness of Mr. Grigg suggested that the anomaly had left traces not in the machinery, but in human behaviour. A slight flinch here, a carefully chosen word there, these were the footprints that the patient inspector intended to follow. By late afternoon, the town had largely settled into a rhythm of polite curiosity. Shops opened and closed, deliveries arrived, and the mundane life of Flaxborough persisted, as if unconcerned by invisible technical failures. And yet beneath this ordinary surface, small observations, like faint shadows in the corners of rooms, hinted at perturbation. Purbright, reviewing his mental notes in the quiet of his office, reflected that the simplest anomaly often illuminated the most complex human patterns. As the day drew to an end, the inspector allowed himself a quiet, self-amused satisfaction. The town had already begun to reveal its character through its response to the missing minute: pride, suspicion, curiosity, and a touch of theatricality. He recognized in this tapestry of reactions the first clues of what might eventually prove significant. Yet he also knew, with that habitual certainty of his, that the story was far from fully told. The broadcast would return the following evening, technical issues presumably resolved, but the true signal of motive, temperament, and human idiosyncrasy was already transmitting quietly in the tones, the gestures, and the whispered conjectures of the townsfolk. Purbright would listen carefully, patiently, and without undue alarm, for he had learned that in Flaxborough the truth often spoke softly, and only to those with ears trained to subtlety. By the following morning, Inspector Purbright had settled into the deliberate rhythm that the case demanded. He began with a return to the station, where the hum of machinery now appeared innocuous, yet he approached the console with the same patient scrutiny as a botanist examining a rare specimen. Mr. Grigg, seated stiffly at his desk, looked up with polite apprehension. "Inspector," he murmured, "I have reviewed the recordings. Everything seems in order." Purbright inclined his head. "Naturally, Mr. Grigg. Yet one observes that anomalies are rarely self-explanatory. Would you walk me through the sequence of events, step by step?" The presenter nodded, and with a careful cadence recounted the final moments before the disruption. He spoke of routine checks, the standard cues, the precise timing of the missing minute. Throughout he avoided glancing at the inspector, as though the act of eye contact might betray some unspoken awareness. Next, Purbright sought the perspective of Miss Holloway, who guided him patiently through the wiring and backup systems. She described each action in measured tones, detailing restarts and technical resets. Occasionally, her gaze drifted to a corner of the room where a small notebook lay, open and unattended, its pages crowded with annotations in a neat, ping script. Purbright observed this without comment, cataloguing the minor details that often proved decisive in Flaxborough cases. An overlooked note, a hesitant gesture, the way someone's eyes lingered on an object. The inspector then made his way to the homes of those who had been most vocal in the morning's speculations. Mrs. Pemberton, standing behind her sweet shop counter, recounted the incident with theatrical emphasis. Purbright listened with quiet amusement, noting her insistence on deliberate interference, her unshakable certainty, and the peculiar satisfaction she derived from casting suspicion upon the town's council. He asked only polite clarifying questions, observing the rhythm of her speech, the subtle shifts in posture, the faint twitch of her hands when mentioning names. These, he knew, were the true footprints of human reaction. At the post office, Mr. Gibbons demonstrated his habitual precision, providing exact times of letters sent and received. He emphasized the town's dependency on routine and how the missing broadcast might have subtly undermined this order. Purbright asked about other anomalies in service and noted that Mr. Gibbons's account wavered slightly when pressed on minor timings, an imperceptible hesitation that suggested either misremembering or a desire to elevate the perceived importance of the disruption. The librarian, Miss Ballard, spoke in quieter tones, her words precise but laced with opinion. She described the reactions of patrons, the speculative conjectures about the cause, and the way the town collectively processed the absence of sound. Purbright found in her account a mixture of factual observation and social interpretation, the kind of combination that often revealed more than the speakers intended. He thanked her politely, making no indication that her remarks would influence his ongoing considerations. Even the railway commuters contributed, each in their own understated way. Mr. Trundle, concerned with schedules and social order, recounted the minute's absence in terms of cascading disruptions, while Mrs. Kenworthy spoke of domestic inconveniences. Purbright listened, noting that each person filtered the event through their personal priorities. The missing broadcast was at once significant and trivial, depending entirely on who narrated it. By midday, Purbright had compiled a mental map of interactions, reactions, and inconsistencies. The patterns were subtle. A glance too long, a gesture too measured, a phrase repeated with unnecessary emphasis. Each was a thread, and he intended to follow them carefully, without alarm or premature judgment. In Flaxborough, the truth rarely demanded force. It emerged naturally when the observer allowed the town to speak for itself. Returning briefly to the station, he reviewed the technical data once more, not for faults in equipment, but for anomalies in human response. The shift in Mr. Griggs' behavior, Miss Holloway's meticulous caution, even the nervous fidgeting of a junior engineer who had been absent during the night's event, all hinted at layers beneath the surface. Purbright made no overt accusations, merely noted the alignments of behavior, the small irregularities that promised eventual clarity. By afternoon he took a short walk along the cobbled high street, passing shop windows reflecting the soft light of early winter. Observing the townsfolk in motion, shopkeepers arranging goods, mothers guiding children, clerks hurrying with letters, he considered the interplay of routine and disruption. Each person carried with them a small story of the missing minute, filtered through perception and temperament. The inspector's thoughts turned, as they often did, to the quiet peculiarities of human nature. A trivial incident could illuminate pride, fear, and aspiration. The vanished broadcast, minute though it had been, had already revealed fractures, impatience beneath civility, speculation under the guise of concern, subtle misalignments in behavior. Purbright allowed himself a moment of satisfaction at the elegance with which ordinary life could disclose extraordinary patterns. By early evening he returned to his office, notebook in hand, reviewing the catalogue of observations. No conclusion was yet warranted, no suspect named. The investigation remained in its first phase, patient listening, discreet inquiries, subtle cross-checking. And yet Purbright sensed that beneath the polite exterior of the town, the truth had begun its own gentle transmission, waiting for the observer sufficiently attuned to notice. As dusk fell over Flaxborough, the gas lamps flickered to life, casting long shadows across the familiar streets. The town continued its routine, unaware that its behaviours, choices, and idle remarks had already set in motion the careful threads of Purbright's inquiry. He leaned back in his chair, noting the quiet regularity of his surroundings, while, in his mind, the irregularities of human behaviour, the overlooked glances, the misremembered times, the slight tension in otherwise ordinary speech, took on increasing significance. and so the first stage of observation drew to a close. Purbright had asked questions, recorded impressions, and catalogued human reactions. The missing broadcast remained, technically, trivial, yet behaviourally rich. The town had spoken without realising it, and the inspector, ever patient, would continue to listen, knowing that the most revealing clues were often transmitted in whispers, pauses, and gestures, rather than in words alone. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled into the predictable hum of early routine, but the missing broadcast remained the subject of discreet commentary, and Purbright, as always, observed quietly from the margins. It was in this climate that the first convenient suspect emerged, almost inevitably. Mr. Lionel Faraday, a young assistant at the station and a man with a reputation for impatience and mild mischief, found himself at the centre of idle speculation. He had been present on the night of the disappearance, his duties, including the tending of equipment during the midnight segment, and this coincidental timing made him an attractive target for conjecture. The inspector, however, was cautious. He noted Faraday's habitual restlessness, the tendency to fidget with buttons even when unnecessary, yet also observed the consistent manner in which he explained his actions. Faraday spoke with a rehearsed precision, detailing each step taken at the console, the sequence of adjustments, and the interactions with colleagues. He avoided unnecessary embellishment, yet there was a certain tightness in his tone that suggested either a desire to be thoroughly understood or a subtle anxiety about being misunderstood. Purbright catalogued these behaviours without comment, aware that in Flaxborough the inclination to suspect often exceeded evidence. At the same time, he noticed an oddly placed object on the floor of the control room, a small, half-filled cup of tea, previously unnoticed, slightly teetering against the leg of a chair. It seemed trivial, entirely inconsequential, yet the inspector's trained eye detected a detail. A faint ring of dried tea on the carpet, not perfectly aligned with any chair, suggesting that the cup had been moved or replaced hastily. It was a minor irregularity, almost laughable in its insignificance, but Purbright filed it away mentally. In past experiences, it was the smallest details that often betrayed intentions, hesitations, or missteps. Meanwhile, gossip flourished elsewhere. Mrs. Pemberton insisted to a pair of visiting neighbours that Faraday must have tampered with the system, her argument relying more on narrative satisfaction than factual verification. The councillors, while polite, asked pointed questions during the informal mid-morning gathering in the tea-room, eager to assign responsibility. Mr. Gibbons, for his part, viewed Faraday's youthful presence as a natural explanation, citing the man's nervous energy and proximity to the controls. The consensus, in polite tones but with emphatic certainty, leaned toward the assistant as the guilty party, a tidy conclusion that simplified the narrative of inconvenience. Purbright, however, was not persuaded. He observed Faraday discreetly throughout the morning, noting his habitual glances at colleagues, the slight adjustment of spectacles, and the consistent avoidance of speculation. The young man performed routine tasks efficiently, his movements precise, his answers measured, and yet there was a peculiar hesitancy in his interactions with Mr. Grigg, a subtle, almost imperceptible deference that suggested not guilt, but awareness of hierarchy. It was the kind of behavioural detail that only an attentive observer could appreciate, and Purbright's mind stored it alongside the tiny irregularity of the cup. In the afternoon, the inspector revisited the station's technical data, not for signs of tampering, but to note the precise moments at which the signal faltered and resumed. The sequence was unremarkable, almost entirely consistent with a temporary anomaly, yet the timing of Faraday's interventions coincided precisely with the signal's absence. A less patient observer might have concluded culpability at once, but Purbright considered alternative explanations, delayed relay systems, momentary misalignment of wiring, or even minor atmospheric interference. Each possibility required careful weighing, and he refrained from action beyond observation. By late afternoon, a second perspective emerged to complicate matters. Miss Holloway, speaking privately with Purbright, mentioned that she had observed a flicker in the wiring that corresponded with the precise moment of disruption. She described it casually, as though noting an inconvenience in routine, yet the inspector registered her tone carefully. She did not suggest Faraday's interference, nor did she imply malicious intent, merely an irregularity in the equipment. Yet within Flaxborough's social narrative, this small observation would be overshadowed by the convenience of a scapegoat. Purbright spent the remainder of the day cross-referencing behavioral details. Faraday's consistency, Miss Holloway's non-judgmental observation, and the tiny tea-ring on the floor formed a web of subtle clues. None indicated direct culpability, but the interplay between them suggested an unnoticed sequence: human error, anxiety, minor misalignments, or perhaps a combination thereof. The key, as always, would lie in the patient observation of reaction rather than the immediate assignment of blame. As evening fell, the inspector took a brief walk along the high street, noting that the town had largely accepted Faraday's supposed guilt. Conversations in shop doorways and across fences referenced the young assistant in polite terms of admonishment, and even Mr. Grigg, with characteristic civility, had allowed a small sigh of relief to escape. Yet Purbright, reflecting on the tiny irregularities, recognized that a premature accusation risked masking the true source of the anomaly. In Flaxborough, the apparently neat solution was often a mirage. The real answer lay hidden beneath layers of routine, propriety, and understated misdirection. Returning to his office, the inspector catalogued the day's observations, recording Faraday's behavior, the subtle tension among staff, the cup of tea, and the minor irregularity noted by Miss Holloway. He allowed himself a quiet smile at the elegance of human unpredictability. A simple event, the missing broadcast, had already revealed so much about the town: deference, suspicion, impatience, and the irresistible urge to assign blame neatly. The convenience of a scapegoat might comfort the many, but Purbright knew that the truth, as always, required patience, attention, and the subtle weaving together of details that everyone else dismissed. By the time gas lamps flickered to life along the cobbled streets, the inspector had decided on his next step, a patient test of reaction. He would pose a gentle question, observe the timing of responses, and without overt accusation, allow the smallest irregularity to guide the inquiry. In Flaxborough, where civility masked ambition and pride concealed error, even the most trivial object, a cup of tea, a glance, a hesitation, could illuminate motives with remarkable clarity. And Purbright, ever patient, intended to listen. The morning sun glinted off the frost-dusted rooftops of Flaxborough as Inspector Purbright returned to the station, notebook in hand, intent on following the threads that had begun to reveal themselves. The town had largely accepted the narrative of young Faraday's supposed culpability, yet the inspector remained unmoved by polite consensus. He moved with quiet purpose through the corridor to the control room, noting the ordinary rhythm of staff and the muted hum of machinery, all of which belied the subtle tension beneath. It was Miss Holloway who first drew his attention to the trivial anomaly that would shift his focus. As she sorted through logs, she mentioned, almost casually, a single note tucked between the technical sheets, a brief scrawl in hurried ink that read, "Check delay, 11:59, signal uncertain." Purbright's gaze lingered on the page. It was neither signed nor dated, yet its presence suggested recent attention. The ink, slightly smudged, indicated a moment of distraction or haste, perhaps written in response to the very interruption that had prompted investigation. For the untrained eye, it was inconsequential. For Purbright, It carried the faint whisper of intention. Faraday, standing at the far console, glanced toward the inspector, eyebrows raised, clearly aware of the note. Yet he offered no explanation beyond the ordinary. It had been found among the logs when Miss Holloway had begun sorting records, and he had moved it aside, assuming its significance negligible. His casual acceptance of the note, combined with the absence of any visible connection to deliberate interference, provided both an apparent alibi and a subtle tension in his demeanor. Purbright catalogued the reaction, noting the brief hesitation in speech, the slight delay in the tilt of the head, and the careful alignment of his hands on the console. Outside the station, Flaxborough's streets moved with quiet familiarity. Shopkeepers arranged their wares, children scurried past the baker's window, and the post office bell jingled intermittently. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, small ripples of tension persisted. Mrs. Pemberton, as ever, offered her unsolicited interpretations, suggesting that the note was likely the handiwork of some invisible mischief-maker, a notion echoed in muted tones by the town clerk during his mid-morning visit to the station. The inspector allowed the gossip to drift past his attention, focusing instead on the interactions between the young assistant and the technician. By late morning, Purbright had begun a subtle sequence of inquiries. He requested that Faraday and Miss Holloway retrace the steps taken during the previous night's broadcast, observing their mannerisms, hesitations, and the interplay of speech. Each action was deliberate yet measured. Each response was courteous yet revealing. It was in these small deviations, adjusting the microphone slightly too often, glancing at the note when unobserved, a faint tightening of the lips, that the inspector found the true contours of human behavior. Meanwhile, at the post office and in the sweet shop, gossip continued to layer over fact. The narrative of a culpable assistant persisted, reinforced by the natural human tendency to prefer tidy solutions. Yet Purbright noted that the more the town focused on Faraday, the more subtle cues were overlooked. Miss Holloway's quiet observation about the mislaid note and the minute discrepancy in the timing of system restarts were invisible to all but a careful eye. These were the threads that, once followed, would ultimately reveal the inconspicuous architecture of the anomaly. By early afternoon, the inspector revisited Mr. Grigg, who now appeared slightly more relaxed, yet remained under an unspoken strain. He recounted, again with polite precision, the sequence of announcements, the timing of cues, and the exact moment of the disruption. Purbright observed the presenter's eye movement and inflection, noting the habitual adjustments to posture that accompanied delicate recollection. There was no overt deception, yet the careful alignment of behavior hinted at unacknowledged concern, perhaps embarrassment, or even unconscious concealment of minor error. Purbright then turned his attention back to the note. Its placement, between technical logs yet distinctly separate, suggested a deliberate act, either of anticipation or response. He considered the possibility that someone had recorded the anomaly as it occurred, intending to revisit it later. It was not evidence of guilt, not yet, but it was a signal, a behavioral clue that demanded patient observation. He made no mention of suspicion, merely catalogued the alignment of human behavior, timing, and subtle irregularities. By late afternoon, the inspector left the station to wander the town, walking slowly along the high street, observing interactions. Shopkeepers exchanged brief updates, children darted through the chilly air, and commuters consulted their watches. Every gesture, every word, carried the faint imprint of reaction to the missing broadcast. It was here, in these ordinary behaviors, that Purbright discerned patterns invisible to others. The avoidance of eye contact, the slight hesitation in speech, the casual deflection of attention from minor details. Returning to his office before dusk, Purbright reflected on the day's observations. The mislaid note, the slight irregularities in behavior, and the persistent social narratives all suggested a complex web, easily misunderstood by those who preferred immediate judgment. In Flaxborough, civility and routine masked error, pride, and subtle tensions. The lost broadcast was minor, yet it had illuminated the town's character with remarkable clarity. By evening, gas lamps flickered to life along the streets, casting long shadows across familiar facades. Purbright reviewed his notes, each observation meticulously catalogued. The note, though trivial in appearance, had become the pivot of his inquiry. It suggested intention, awareness, or at least observation. Coupled with the subtle human responses he had tracked, it indicated that the truth lay not in equipment or immediate appearances, but in the interplay of minor irregularities, hesitations, and understated reactions. Thus concluded the 5th day of observation. The town had spoken in whispers, gestures, and small notes, revealing patterns to those who knew how to listen. Purbright, ever patient, understood that the most delicate details often guided the most decisive conclusions. And as Flaxborough's ordinary evening settled, he prepared for the next stage. Careful testing, polite inquiry, and the gradual unraveling of subtle human missteps that together would illuminate the true course of events. By the following morning, the station felt subtly different, as though the missing broadcast had shifted the rhythm of Flaxborough in imperceptible ways. Inspector Purbright arrived early, notebook in hand, and observed the staff quietly preparing for the day's work. Mr. Grigg moved among the consoles with precise motions, Miss Holloway sorted records with careful efficiency, and Faraday, ever attentive, adjusted his equipment with the air of someone conscious of external scrutiny. None of these motions were unusual individually, but together they formed a delicate choreography, each movement hinting at personal investment in the events of the preceding days. Purbright began his expanded inquiries by revisiting familiar figures in town, seeking context and cross-referencing details from multiple perspectives. At the library, Miss Ballard provided additional observations. She had noted, she said, that a few townsfolk lingered longer than usual in front of the post office, speaking in hushed tones and exchanging occasional glances. To anyone else it might have seemed trivial, yet Purbright recognized the subtle undercurrent of concern, the minor posturing that reflected private curiosity more than public interest. The inspector then paid a visit to the railway buffet, where the porter, a man with a keen eye for habitual patterns, reported odd behaviors among regular commuters during the previous night's missed broadcast. Some had remarked aloud about technical failings or possible sabotage, while others displayed inexplicable anxiety over the trivial delay. Purbright listened attentively, noting the precise choice of words and the slight exaggeration in tone, both of which hinted at underlying social dynamics rather than direct evidence of fault. Back at the station, the interactions among staff provided further subtle clues. Faraday and Miss Holloway engaged in a polite exchange over the timing of a signal test, their voices measured and careful. A junior engineer, recently assigned to maintenance, hovered near the edge of the room, hesitant to speak, yet glancing repeatedly at the same cup of tea that had first drawn Purbright's attention. It was a minor gesture, seemingly inconsequential, but Purbright catalogued it alongside the note and earlier observations, recognizing a pattern of quiet hesitation. The town itself contributed additional layers of complexity. In the post office, Mr. Gibbons detailed minor irregularities in mail timing, which he had previously overlooked, emphasizing his dedication to precision and his subtle irritation at any disruption. Mrs. Pemberton added a further twist, recounting a conversation overheard near the council chambers, suggesting that a member of the staff might have had a motive after all, though she offered no proof and was careful to couch her remarks in hypothetical language. Purbright, as always, paid attention less to the content than to the manner of delivery. The slight lean, the casual emphasis on particular words, the hesitation before phrasing conjecture. By early afternoon, Purbright had expanded his inquiries to a wider circle, including individuals who had not previously entered the investigation. Mr. Trundle, the punctual commuter, described an observation of Miss Holloway adjusting wires with particular care, noting in passing that the young technician had seemed unusually alert to minor fluctuations. Mrs. Kenworthy, the domestic-minded observer, mentioned that she had noticed Faraday lingering near the console in an almost theatrical manner, a behaviour she interpreted as nervousness. These details, though superficially contradictory, provided a richer tapestry of human response than any technical report could offer. Purbright, reviewing his mental catalogue of behaviour, noted subtle alignments and contrasts. The mislaid note, Faraday's careful gestures, Miss Holloway's measured diligence, Mr. Grigg's disciplined presentation, all contributed to a growing web of interpersonal dynamics. None pointed conclusively to fault, but collectively they highlighted tensions and priorities, revealing the influence of pride, hierarchy, and social perception. The missing broadcast, though trivial in itself, had exposed hidden layers of motivation and attention within the town's civic microcosm. Later, in the station's control room, Purbright observed interactions in real time. Faraday adjusted the microphones with habitual care, Miss Holloway annotated records with deliberate precision, and Mr. Grigg conducted brief checks of the playback system, each action consistent with their known routines, yet tinged with a faint self-consciousness. The inspector noted minor discrepancies. The slight delay in glances, the hesitant repetition of phrases, the barely perceptible tightening of posture, all of which contributed to his understanding of human behaviour under subtle pressure. By evening, Purbright had completed the day's round of observation. The town had spoken in whispers, gestures, and minor deviations from routine, revealing patterns imperceptible to all but the attentive observer. He returned to his office, noting the gas lamps flickering to life outside, and catalogued the day's findings: mislaid note, hesitant gestures, repeated glances, subtle social signals, and the complex interplay of gossip and interpretation. As the streets of Flaxborough settled into dusk, the inspector allowed himself a quiet reflection. The field of inquiry had expanded, new voices had entered the narrative, and tensions, both imagined and real, were beginning to shape the town's understanding of the anomaly. The missing broadcast was still unresolved, yet its investigation had revealed layers of human behaviour, hidden priorities, and minor but telling irregularities. Purbright understood that the next stage would require careful testing of these dynamics, polite prodding, and the patient observation of how individuals responded to subtle cues. The town, outwardly calm, was already supplying the necessary hints. Purbright, ever patient and unobtrusive, would continue to observe, allowing Flaxborough's ordinary routines to transmit the extraordinary truth of human motivation, intention, and the delicate architecture of social conduct that lay behind a seemingly trivial technical failure. The day began with an ordinary calm, yet Flaxborough, as Purbright had long observed, often concealed subtle upheavals beneath its polite routines. By mid-morning, the first hint of the second anomaly arose in the station itself. A brief but unmistakable interference occurred during the morning playback of pre-recorded segments, a sharp, fleeting crackle, barely half a second in length, followed by a rapid return to normal sound. To the casual listener, it might have seemed inconsequential, yet the inspector noted it immediately. Timing, pattern, and reaction were as important to him as the sound itself. Miss Holloway, hovering near the console, adjusted her equipment with almost imperceptible tension. Faraday, standing by the side, glanced at the inspector and then toward the technical logs, a faint crease appearing between his brows. Even Mr. Grigg, usually composed, flinched slightly and muttered, "Another interruption." in carefully measured tones. Each reaction, though understated, provided Purbright with behavioral nuances that he catalogued without comment. The technical anomaly itself was minor, the human response far more telling. Outside the station, gossip began to circulate almost immediately, though no one could describe the disturbance in precise terms. Mrs. Pemberton, standing at her shop window, murmured that it must be deliberate this time, while Mr. Gibbons, never one to ignore disorder, suggested that the town's pride in its broadcast was being tested. Purbright observed the spread of conjecture with interest. He understood that a second incident, however minor, would destabilize any narrative the town had previously accepted, introducing doubt, anxiety, and new avenues for observation. Within the control room, Purbright began subtle questioning, posing innocuous queries about the timing of the interference, the precise sequence of technical adjustments, and the observations of each staff member. Faraday spoke carefully, noting that he had not touched any controls during the brief interruption. Miss Holloway confirmed the same, describing a momentary flicker in the output signal. Purbright listened, his tone polite, noting the alignment of testimony, the minute hesitation before each affirmation, and the consistency of gestures with previous behaviors. Small discrepancies emerged, a half-second pause here, a slight avoidance of eye contact there, enough to intrigue without alarming. By early afternoon, the inspector had also gathered input from the town's peripheral observers. Mr. Trundle, at the railway, had noticed a subtle change in the public broadcast in the station cafe. The sound had cracked briefly, he said, with a slight hesitation as though uncertain of his own observation. Mrs. Kenworthy mentioned that she had felt a vague unease, noticing Faraday adjusting the dials a little too often for comfort, though she admitted she could be imagining it. Purbright recorded all observations carefully, noting the interplay of perception, expectation, and minor variations in behavior. Meanwhile, the small cup of tea, previously overlooked, again drew his attention. Its position on the console had shifted slightly since the morning, though no one seemed to have touched it intentionally. A minor detail, yet in the sequence of observed irregularities it suggested either distraction, oversight, or subtle signaling, any of which could illuminate patterns invisible to ordinary eyes. The inspector filed it alongside the mislaid note, the first interference, and the reactions of staff, forming an interconnected map of behavior rather than hardware. By late afternoon, Purbright revisited Mr. Grigg, who now appeared faintly more anxious despite his attempts at composure. The inspector inquired gently about any deviation in routine that day, any minor technical alteration, or variation in timing. Grigg answered carefully, noting only the ordinary sequence of announcements and minor adjustments, yet the subtle tension in his phrasing, the slight tightness in shoulders, and the brief lifting of the eyes to avoid inspection all registered with Purbright. Each human microcosm carried its own tale, and he attended to them as one might study the unfolding of a complex, quiet play. The second interference, though brief and technically trivial, had a significant effect. It destabilized assumptions and opened new avenues of observation. Faraday, previously considered a convenient suspect, now appeared more uncertain. His calm consistency of the previous days gave way to subtle signs of distraction. Miss Holloway remained diligent but alert, her precision tinged with a trace of heightened awareness. Even Mr. Grigg, the presenter, seemed to measure each motion and word more carefully, as though conscious of every minor imperfection. By early evening, Purbright reflected in his office on the implications. The first incident had provided a field of observation, a way to catalogue reactions and measure behavior. The second had altered the map, introducing nuances that could not be ignored. The town's polite speculation, Faraday's apparent hesitation, Miss Holloway's careful vigilance, the slight movements of a cup of tea, all were subtle indicators, tiny shifts in a pattern that, when connected, would reveal the truth. The broadcast itself remained secondary. Human behavior had become the primary signal. As dusk fell over Flaxborough, the gas lamps flickered along the streets, casting long shadows. Purbright reviewed his notes, timing, gestures, hesitations, minor inconsistencies, all catalogued for careful consideration. The second interference, trivial to any technical observer, had succeeded in drawing out subtle reactions and introducing doubt into previously accepted narratives. The town, outwardly calm, was revealing its true patterns under the inspector's attentive observation. Purbright closed his notebook with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood the significance of small irregularities. The stage was set for careful testing, patient probing, and eventual revelation. In Flaxborough, where civility often masked ambition, error and pride, even the slightest anomaly, could illuminate motives if observed with sufficient patience, and the inspector, as always, would listen attentively, cataloguing each nuance while maintaining the polite invisibility that allowed human nature to speak freely. As dusk deepened over Flaxborough, Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, reviewing the growing collection of observations. The missing broadcast, the mislaid note, the brief interference, the shifted cup of tea, each trivial in isolation, yet collectively a lattice of subtle irregularities that spoke more clearly than any overt confession could. He allowed himself a moment to consider human nature, for it was in these small deviations from routine that people revealed their true priorities, anxieties, and occasional prideful miscalculations. Purbright's thoughts wandered first to Faraday. The young assistant's meticulous attention, combined with minor hesitations in gesture and speech, suggested not deliberate interference, but a heightened awareness of scrutiny. Faraday had been framed by circumstance more than action, yet the inspector remained mindful of the human tendency to perform in response to observation. Small behaviors could signify conscious concealment or simple self-consciousness. Distinguishing between the two required patience, calm, and repeated observation. Miss Holloway's steadiness was equally revealing. Her quiet efficiency, coupled with subtle alertness, indicated both competence and awareness of irregularity, yet she displayed no overt anxiety. Purbright considered her perspective, attentive, careful, and likely noting discrepancies that even he might not initially have catalogued. The technician's minor adjustments to dials, the precise timing of annotations, and her occasional glances toward the console suggested a cognitive map of events that paralleled and occasionally intersected with his own mental catalogue. The town, meanwhile, continued its performance of ordinary civility. Shops remained open, children darted through streets, and the post office rang with orderly efficiency. Yet beneath this surface, behaviours, gestures, phrases, timing, carried their own narratives. Mrs. Pemberton's insistence on conspiracy, Mr. Gibbon's minor irritations, commuters' subtle exaggerations, and the quiet whispers of regular patrons all provided a backdrop against which the inspector could triangulate patterns of attention and response. The human element, he reflected, was far more instructive than any technical record. Purbright paused to consider the alignment of events. The first interruption had provided a baseline, the mislaid note a hint of attentive observation, and the second interference a stress test of behavior. Each incident had allowed him to examine reactions, both subtle and overt. He appreciated the elegance of this progression. Minor irregularities compelling individuals to reveal themselves not by words, but by timing, gestures, and small misalignments of routine. The town itself had become a theatre, and he, unobtrusively, its audience. He reflected on civility in Flaxborough, politeness masked pride, deference and occasional envy, and small technical disturbances acted as catalysts for human expression. The inspector noted how social hierarchy influenced reaction. Staff deferred to Mr. Grigg. Faraday adjusted his behavior in anticipation of observation, and even peripheral witnesses modulated their responses according to whom they believed was listening. These patterns, subtle yet consistent, illuminated social dynamics with greater clarity than any interrogation could achieve. Turning back to his notes, Purbright considered minor inconsistencies. The cup of tea had shifted slightly during the day. Faraday's glances occasionally lingered longer than necessary. Miss Holloway's repeated checks were more precise than required. Each observation was, on its own, trivial. In combination, they suggested a web of attention, anticipation, and minor missteps. The human element, Purbright knew, was always the key in Flaxborough. Gestures revealed truth when words often obscured it. As evening light faded to the muted glow of gas lamps, the inspector allowed himself quiet amusement. A seemingly trivial broadcast, a missing minute of sound, had become a prism through which the town's character, behavior, and social tensions could be examined. The threads of observation were weaving a narrative of intention and reaction, one that required no overt revelation, only patient listening and careful cataloguing of human detail. Purbright considered the next phase of his inquiry. He would introduce subtle tests, polite inquiries that might disturb equilibrium, just enough to reveal intention. The second interference had already created an opening, tension, anticipation, and minor deviations in behavior. Now, with patience, he could begin to trace reactions, observe subtle shifts, and note how each individual adjusted to perceived scrutiny. The town's behavior, he reminded himself, was the real evidence, and the anomalies, however small, were the keys to understanding. By the close of day, the inspector felt a quiet satisfaction. The sequence of minor disturbances had illuminated character, revealed tendencies, and suggested avenues for polite, unobtrusive investigation. The town continued its routines, outwardly serene, yet beneath the surface, small signals were being transmitted and received. Purbright, attentive, patient, and entirely unassuming, would continue to observe, knowing that the truth often emerged in whispers, gestures, and imperceptible deviations long before formal evidence was necessary. He closed his notebook, took a slow breath, and permitted himself the faintest smile. In Flaxborough, civility and minor technical mishaps had proven once again that human behavior was a more reliable indicator than the machinery itself. The next stage would demand subtle, prodding, careful staging and patient observation. And Purbright, as ever, would listen with meticulous attention, cataloguing the faintest clue, knowing that the ordinary often concealed the extraordinary. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke with the familiar rhythm of routine, yet within the station a subtle tension lingered. Inspector Purbright arrived early, notebook in hand, and observed the staff as they prepared for the day's broadcast. Mr. Grigg adjusted his papers with deliberate care. Faraday moved quietly among the consoles, and Miss Holloway checked cables and logs with precise, methodical attention. Each motion was ordinary, yet the inspector noted minute deviations, anticipating that the day would provide the opportunity for a polite, deliberate test. Purbright began with a casual inquiry, approaching the console and remarking on a hypothetical minor error in the previous night's broadcast. "I wonder," he said in measured tones, "if such anomalies could be detected from even the smallest variation in cable alignment. I suppose we might check that again, purely to satisfy curiosity." His words were neutral, courteous, devoid of accusation, yet the phrasing and timing were deliberate, intended to draw responses without overt pressure. Faraday's reaction was subtle but immediate. His hands paused over the dials, a brief flush rising to his cheeks, and his eyes flicked to Miss Holloway for confirmation. He answered with careful precision, detailing the prior checks, noting that no unusual movements had occurred, yet his voice carried the faintest tremor, just enough to indicate heightened awareness. Purbright catalogued the shift, the hesitation, the half-second misalignment in posture, the rapid refocusing of attention. Miss Holloway, equally attentive, responded with calm professionalism, describing her routine verifications and noting that everything appeared in order. Yet even she displayed a minor, almost imperceptible tightening of the lips and a brief pause before glancing at the mislaid note on the desk. Purbright filed these responses alongside the subtle tremor in Faraday's reaction, recognizing that the combination of careful procedure and small discomforts could illuminate priorities and intentions. The inspector then introduced another element, a casual observation regarding Mr. Grigg. "I noticed," he remarked lightly, "that during the morning playback there was a faint crackle, almost imperceptible, though one might imagine it could prompt slight concern. The phrasing, polite and indirect, was designed to allow each staff member to reveal their natural responses without feeling accused." Grigg, for his part, adjusted his papers and nodded with the measured politeness of a presenter accustomed to scrutiny, yet a faint crease appeared between his brows, and his glance toward the console lingered just slightly longer than necessary. By mid-morning, Purbright's subtle test had produced a series of small but telling reactions. Faraday's precision, previously confident, now carried traces of anxiety. Miss Holloway's composed diligence revealed brief hesitations, and even Grigg's habitual composure betrayed a quiet attentiveness to minor irregularities. None of the staff acted overtly, none confessed, yet their behaviors were now layered with minor indicators, small signals that revealed the interplay of concern, responsibility, and human instinct under scrutiny. Outside the station, the town continued its ordinary routines, but Purbright noted the way gossip subtly adapted to perceived tension. Conversations at the post office, the sweet shop, and along the high street hinted at anticipation of error, the polite suspicion of human fallibility, yet none touched the technical specifics. These social currents, he recognized, were themselves a part of the subtle experiment. How would minor provocation affect perception, demeanor, and interpretation? By early afternoon, the inspector observed the staff during a routine test broadcast. A small, deliberate adjustment in the system, described in neutral terms as an experiment for curiosity, prompted a flurry of precise movements and attentive corrections. Faraday's fingers hovered longer than necessary, eyes darting briefly to the mislaid note. Miss Holloway repeated verifications with added meticulousness. Grigg monitored timing with minute attention to detail. Purbright recorded each gesture, pause, and glance, interpreting the responses as behavioral data rather than evidence of technical fault. The subtle test also revealed the human tendency to overcompensate when under polite observation. Faraday, who had previously moved with quiet efficiency, now double-checked minor alignments and repeated verbal confirmations, as though reinforcing credibility. Miss Holloway performed additional calibrations, her concentration heightened yet unflustered, while Grigg's habitual composure became slightly more rigid, his voice measured in even greater care. Each response was informative, a small but cumulative demonstration of human attention and inclination toward precision under implied scrutiny. By evening, Purbright reflected on the results of the day's quiet experiment. No one had acted with overt deceit, yet the subtle shifts in behavior revealed more than any direct questioning could. Anxiety, attentiveness, and minor adjustments, the human elements, spoke volumes. The combination of the first broadcast failure, the mislaid note, the brief interference, and this polite probing had now produced a behavioral map detailed enough to inform the next stage of inquiry. As gas lamps flickered to life along Flaxborough's streets, Purbright catalogued his observations, tremors in tone, micro-pauses in speech, slight physical hesitations, and the interplay of attention and routine. Each was a thread to be followed, yet none provided hasty conclusions. The town, its civility, intact, continued to perform its ordinary functions, unaware that their small reactions, gestures, and subtle shifts in attention had become the true evidence. The inspector, patient as ever, understood that the quiet experiment had succeeded. The next stage would bring clarity without need for confrontation, relying solely on observation, timing, and human inclination to reveal the truth. By mid-morning, Purbright had invited the key participants to the station's quiet conference room under the pretense of reviewing routine broadcast procedures. The room was modest, with a polished oak table and a faint smell of ink and warm paper. Mr. Grigg, Faraday, and Miss Holloway arrived promptly, each maintaining polite composure, yet the inspector noticed the subtle tension in posture, the micro-expressions, and the careful alignment of gestures that had become familiar markers over the past week. Purbright began in his characteristic understated manner. "Thank you all for attending," he said, voice calm, measured, entirely free of reproach. "We are here to review recent anomalies, not to assign blame. It is important that we understand what occurred and how minor irregularities can ripple into perceived disturbances." His tone encouraged honesty while quietly setting the stage for the revelation that would follow. He motioned to the console and the neatly stacked technical logs. First, the missing broadcast at 11:59. It was brief, unremarkable technically, yet it allowed us to observe responses under minor pressure. Each action and gesture, each hesitation has provided insight into human attention and the natural alignment of responsibility. He paused, letting the words settle. No one spoke. The silence itself was informative, the tension momentarily suspended. Purbright then addressed the mislaid note. "This note," he said, holding the sheet between thumb and forefinger, "appeared to anticipate or record the anomaly. It is unsigned and undated, yet the ink and placement reveal that it was written reflexively, in response to observation, rather than intent to manipulate events." Faraday glanced at the note, the crease of his brow softening, while Miss Holloway's lips pursed in slight recognition. He moved on to the second interference. "The brief crackle noted during playback yesterday," he continued, "was not caused by human interference, nor by any neglect in equipment. Minor fluctuations, atmospheric variation, and the natural response of relay systems created a temporary irregularity. It was imperceptible to most, yet elicited behavior that, while cautious, was entirely appropriate under circumstances." Purbright's calm delivery prevented defensiveness, allowing the staff to absorb the truth without embarrassment. The inspector then emphasized the behavioral observations. "What we have learned is instructive. Faraday, your attention to detail and slight hesitations revealed conscientiousness under observation. Miss Holloway, your careful adjustments and alertness demonstrated professional diligence. Mr. Grigg, your composure, though subtly affected, reflected responsibility and awareness of leadership." Each phrase was deliberate, acknowledging the small stresses and human tendencies without assigning fault. He gestured toward the cup of tea. Even the smallest elements, like this cup, were instructive, not because of error, but because they provided subtle signals of attention, minor hesitation, and responsiveness. Together with logs, notes, and brief anomalies, these small details allowed a map of human behavior to emerge, revealing intentions without confrontation. The inspector's eyes swept the room calmly, observing the relaxed acknowledgement forming on the faces of those present. Purbright concluded by linking the entire sequence. In short, there was no deliberate interference. The missing broadcast, the mislaid note, the brief crackle, all were technical or incidental, yet they produced measurable human responses. Your reactions, subtle though they were, allowed us to understand how attentiveness, hierarchy, and personal pride manifest under minor stress. No one acted improperly. The truth has simply been in the ordinary responses we observed. Faraday exhaled, a faint smile forming, relief softening his previous tension. Miss Holloway nodded quietly, her lips curling in restrained amusement at the careful attention the inspector had paid to what she had considered trivial details. Grigg, maintaining formal posture, allowed a small, imperceptible relaxation of shoulders, acknowledging both the technical explanation and the human insight that had been quietly revealed. Purbright, satisfied, closed the technical logs and placed them neatly on the table. "This exercise," he said softly, "reminds us that in Flaxborough, as in life, the ordinary often conceals extraordinary patterns. Observation, patience, and calm reflection illuminate behavior far more effectively than accusation. That is the lesson and the explanation for these events." The room remained quiet for a moment longer, the trio absorbing the clarity of both technical and human resolution. Then, as if in unison, the tension dispersed. Polite nods, small murmurs of acknowledgement, and the resumption of normal duties. Outside, the town carried on in its familiar rhythm, unaware of the subtle orchestration that had allowed the truth to emerge without drama, conflict, or embarrassment. Purbright rose, adjusting his hat. The anomalies had been resolved, human behaviours documented, and the narrative restored to ordinary civility. The town, its patterns now understood, had spoken freely through gestures, minor hesitations, and careful attention. All had revealed themselves not through overt confession, but through the quiet language of habitual, ordinary conduct. By mid-evening, as gas lamps lit the cobbled streets and windows glimmered with domestic warmth, Purbright returned to his office, reflecting on the lessons of the week. Human behavior, even under minor stress, conveys truth more subtly and effectively than any overt observation. Flaxborough had provided all the clues necessary. The careful observer had merely waited, noticed, and connected them. The anomaly was gone, the explanations clear, and civility, as always, restored. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled into its usual rhythm, the week's minor disturbances now receding into memory, though the faintest echoes lingered in the careful attention of those involved. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station, noting the orderly placement of records, the precise alignment of equipment, and the subtle attentiveness of staff, now both relieved and quietly proud of their diligence. The town outside proceeded with habitual civility. Shop windows gleamed, the post office doors opened and closed on schedule, and children's footsteps echoed along cobbled streets. Purbright spent the morning reviewing his notes, cataloguing the small gestures, micro-pauses and subtle behaviours that had revealed more than any technical log. The cup of tea, the mislaid note, the brief interference, and the responses of Faraday, Miss Holloway, and Mr. Grigg were all marked in his mental ledger as examples of ordinary human attention under minor disruption. Nothing required correction, yet everything had been instructive. Each human response, catalogued and observed, had provided insight into priority, hesitation, and subtle pride. In the post office, Mr. Gibbons resumed his precise work, though he cast occasional glances toward the station, perhaps recalling his earlier speculations. Mrs. Pemberton, behind the sweet shop counter, allowed a faint smile to escape as she recounted the past week's narrative to a visiting acquaintance, embellishing slightly yet unconsciously, reflecting the lessons of attention and care. Even the commuters along the high street moved with habitual purpose, their conversations now incorporating minor reflections on the incident, softened by the understanding that human nature, more than mechanical failure, had been at play. Purbright observed quietly, walking slowly among his familiar streets. The town had not been altered in any overt way. Civility, routine, and the gentle rhythms of small-town life persisted. Yet beneath this surface, subtle shifts had occurred. Attentiveness had increased slightly, minor gestures carried more weight, and awareness of the interconnectedness of action and reaction had subtly deepened among those who had been involved. The invisible education of experience imparted without direct instruction was a hallmark of Flaxborough's character. Returning to the station by midday, Purbright noted that technical preparations continued without incident. Faraday moved with assured efficiency, his early attention replaced by quiet confidence. Miss Holloway adjusted records with habitual care, and Mr. Grigg conducted a smooth rehearsal of announcements, precise and unobtrusive. Each carried the lessons of the week in posture, timing, and calm attention, reflecting human adaptability more than technical correction. The inspector allowed himself a quiet approval at the understated diligence of all involved. In the afternoon, he revisited the minor details that had first captured his attention. The note was now filed neatly, the cup of tea placed without irregularity, and the logs meticulously ordered. These trivial objects, once markers of subtle irregularity, now served as reminders of the day-to-day conduct that revealed character and priority. Purbright reflected that in Flaxborough, the ordinary often carried more significance than the extraordinary. Observing behavior, gestures, and hesitation had proved more telling than any overt evidence could. By late afternoon, the station's routines merged seamlessly with the town's broader rhythm. The railway whistle sounded, shopkeepers closed windows with habitual care, and the post office completed its final transactions. Flaxborough, outwardly unchanged, had nonetheless absorbed the subtle lessons of attentiveness, timing, and minor irregularities. Purbright noted that civility remained intact, yet minor human behaviors had aligned slightly differently, shaped by observation and reflection. The inspector returned to his office, reviewing the catalogued observations one final time. Human behavior, subtle and layered, had provided clarity without confrontation. No fault had been found, no blame assigned. The missing broadcast and the minor anomalies had acted as instruments for the demonstration of attentiveness, hierarchy, and discretion. Flaxborough, in its ordinary quiet fashion, had revealed its character, and Purbright had merely observed, patient and unobtrusive. By early evening, as the soft glow of gas lamps illuminated the streets, the inspector allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The town, unchanged in routine yet subtly enriched in attentiveness, had completed its unspoken education. Minor irregularities, human hesitation, and gestures under scrutiny had conveyed more than technical analysis ever could. The missing broadcast, the note, the brief interference, and the subtle tests had all been resolved, the lessons absorbed naturally and quietly. Purbright, settling into his chair, reflected on the elegance of small-town observation. Routine had been preserved, civility maintained, and subtle human tendencies revealed. Flaxborough had spoken without fanfare, conveying truth through gestures, hesitations, and attentiveness. The inspector's work, patient and methodical, had allowed ordinary life to demonstrate its own extraordinary clarity. The town, once perturbed by trivial anomalies, had returned to its quiet order, enriched subtly by the week's minor disruptions.